Why, hello there. It's Christina Quinn from Try This. The team over here at the Washington Post has been thinking a lot about the upcoming election. It's a big one. And my colleagues recently published an episode of Post Reports that is a lesson in how election polls work. The episode will help you understand how to read polls and why things sometimes get a little tricky. Here at Try This, we are dedicated to helping you learn stuff. So we're sharing the Post Reports episode in this feed. And it's pretty good timing because next week, Try This is set to release something a little different. A brand new audio course, Election Edition. Stay tuned. For now, here's that episode of Post Reports.
So, Emily Gusin, because you're the deputy polling director here at the Post, I want to know what it's like to be asked about a poll over the phone. Like, let's say that I have been chosen to answer a poll that's being conducted by the Washington Post. What does that look like?
Well, first your phone's going to ring for this poll.
Okay, let's do it for real. Okay, so bing, 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 bing. So I pick up the phone. Hello?
Hello, I'm Emily. We're not selling anything, just doing an opinion poll on interesting subjects in the news.
I'm sorry, I'm a little busy right now. How long is this going to take?
Very short. We'd love to have your opinion. May I please speak to Martine?
This is she.
Wonderful. Again, my name is Emily. Before we continue, are you driving or doing anything that requires your full attention right now?
I mean, I'm like washing the dishes, so I guess not.
So, super. We will go ahead then. That's my co-host Martine Powers speaking with Emily Gusin, our deputy polling director. If you're like me or Martine, you may be wondering about all these political polls you've been hearing about right now. So we brought Emily into our studio to help us make sense of election polling this year, and to also give us an idea of what it actually feels like to take a poll over the phone. Are you registered to vote in the District of Columbia or not?
Yes, I am.
Do you think you'll vote in person at a polling place on Election Day? Or vote early, either by mail or in person before Election Day?
I haven't decided that yet, so I'm not sure.
That's okay.
Thanks, Emily. That makes me feel better.
From the newsroom of the Washington Post, this is Post Reports. It's Thursday, October 3rd. I'm Elahe Izadi, and like my co-host Martine, I haven't quite yet finalized my Election Day plans. That's okay. I'd like you to rate the chances that you will vote in the presidential election this November. Are you absolutely certain to vote? Will you probably vote? Are the chances 50-50? Today, Emily Gusin, deputy polling director for The Post. Assuming you vote for president in November, how important will each of these issues be in your choice of which candidate to support? The economy. Is it extremely important? Very important? Somewhat important? Not too important? Emily sits down with Martine to explain everything you need to know about polling. It's just weeks until the election, and we're all seeing these headlines. Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump are tied in Pennsylvania, or Trump leading by a tight margin in Sunbelt states. It's so hard to know what these polls actually mean for Election Day. So Martine and Emily break down how you can be a savvy consumer of polls ahead of November 5th. I'll let Martine take it from here.
So, Emily, I want to start with a pretty basic question. What can a poll tell you?
A poll can give you an idea of what Americans or whatever population we've looked at thinks. So if we are looking at a poll of folks in Nevada or folks in North Carolina, what that population thinks about something. And there's no way to do that better than a poll because we can systematically reach a random sample of the population that we're looking at and ask them questions that represent the larger population. Some people often say, like, well, I didn't get called for this poll, so how can it be representative? Well, if we were asking everyone every time, that would take us like years and be very expensive. So we make sure that we get a randomized group of folks that we can reach out to that represent others. So even if you haven't been reached out to a poll, someone who probably thinks and feels similarly to you has been.
So then on the flip side, what does a poll not tell you?
A poll can't tell you what's going to happen in the future. They're snapshots in time. So we're looking to, when we word those questions, we say, if the election were held today, for whom would you vote? So people are answering for that time period. We also can't really dig down too deep on people's thoughts and feelings because we try to keep questions pretty close-ended so that we can translate those into percentages. We do ask open-ended questions sometimes that give people the ability to expound further, but polls are good at measuring close-ended opinions. It's easier for respondents to respond to and give us a snapshot of what they think at that time.
That snapshot idea feels really important because I think when you see a poll of whether people like one candidate more than another, it feels immediately like, oh, that's going to tell me what's going to happen in November and what the results of the election are going to be. But it's not quite. Like there's a real distinction there. This isn't supposed to tell you who's going to win in November. This is telling you how people feel right now.
Yes, it's October. They might change their opinions. I know that can be hard for people to believe, but there are undecided voters out there. Things happen in their lives and things happen in the world that can change people's opinions. So when we ask questions about the economy, if they lose their job between now and then, God forbid, they could say that their personal finances are not as good as they were before, and vice versa. If they get employment or they get a raise or get a promotion, they can say that they are more financially stable than they did previously. And that can impact their opinions in other ways.
So let me ask this. I think a lot of people, when they turn on TV, when they open the newspaper, they'll see some headline about a poll, like newest poll says that Kamala Harris is up or Kamala Harris is down or whatever. But take me back to like, where does that poll come from? Like, what is the origin of that poll and what is the path that that poll had to take to end up with this headline that makes some broad pronouncement about how Americans' view on something has shifted?
So at the Washington Post, we are really lucky because we have subject matter experts throughout the newsroom. We meet with editors and reporters who cover what we will be asking about. So if it's a national poll about politics, we meet with the politics team. If it is a poll of Virginia voters, we meet with folks who cover Virginia, and we ask them what they want to know. And then we write the questionnaire. We ensure that the questions are balanced and easy to understand. And then we go out into the field. So going out into the field means actually getting people to take our poll.
We're not selling anything, just doing an opinion poll on some interesting subjects in the news.
Do you feel that way strongly or somewhat?
Do you usually think of yourself as a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, or what?
We work with these organizations called field houses, and they're the people who actually ask the questions, whether that's by telephone or by text message or some other way. They're the people who are getting the responses to our poll questions.
How are you, sir?
Would you support or oppose a nationwide ban?
Those are all the questions I have for you today. Thank you so much for your participation, and have a great rest of your evening.
And the way we figure out who to reach out to take a poll is based on this really fundamental aspect of polling called sampling. And sampling is figuring out that sample of people who we'll reach out to, and those people respond to the poll questions. And the sample that we reach out to should be representative of the total universe that we're surveying. So if it's, say, Virginia voters, the sample that we're reaching out to, which is not every single voter in Virginia, it's just the people that we randomly chose to respond to the survey, needs to reflect everyone there. So we want to ensure that the population is reflective. An analogy I like to use is making soup. If you're making soup for your friends who are coming over, you're not going to taste the entire bowl before they get there because then you got nothing to serve them.
And you would be very, very full.
And you'd be a crappy hostess. If you take a ladle and stir it up so that you can mix it up and make sure that, the salt is all over and that the beans are all over
like
and not just in one part. Totally. And then take a tiny taste and be like, yeah, that's the ticket.
And you
that
make sure in the spoon that you got a little bean and you got a little piece of carrot and you make sure that it's got the, that
everybody's in there.
Everyone's in the
It's a nice mix.
Spoon.
It's a little hot bath of public opinion. And if it needs more salt, you go back and you get more salt in there.
Okay, so that helps me understand what a sample is. But then getting back to this idea of this poll that's out in the field, once you get the responses back from people, then what happens?
Then we get a data set. that comes back to us, and it just looks like a list of numbers and nonsense to most people. And we are able to analyze that data by looking at the different responses, but also breaking them down by crosstab. So at the end of all those issue questions, we also ask people about themselves. So we ask them their gender and their zip code and their racial or ethnic identity and their age. And we're able to group people together by those different demographic groups and see if there are trends or interesting things that pop up with those different groups. And then we write the analysis up. We make graphics. We usually team ourselves with different reporters in the newsroom to write a story, and then we release it.
Got it. So that's the point when I'll see a headline that's something along the lines of, new poll finds that Harris and Trump are essentially tied in Pennsylvania. But I think when I see those headlines, there's a term that is often used that I usually don't understand, and I think a lot of people don't understand. And Emily, I think you know what that term is. It's margin of error.
So margin of error, when you're looking at something in a poll, usually the methodology statement will say plus or minus 3 percentage points. And you use that margin to apply to a percentage to show the range of where the number probably is. Since we can't be super precise with polling, it's an art and a science. So if you get a poll back and it says 18% of people hate apples, and the margin of error is plus or minus 3 percentage points, you can subtract 3 points from that 18 to get 15 and add 3 points to 18 to get 21. And you can be certain with 95% of cases that between 15 and 21% of people in that population hate apples. If a poll isn't releasing their margin of error, I would be skeptical. If they're reporting that there's a huge difference between candidates and you look and it's just a 2 percentage point difference, that's not huge. You can be an educated consumer and look at what the margin of error is in a poll and know that it's a close race. Right now, the presidential race is a pretty close contest nationally and in several key states. But in some states, it's not as close. We did a poll in Virginia, and we found Harris leading Trump by 8 percentage points. And we can comfortably say that she's leading there because that 8 percentage point difference was larger than twice our error margin in that poll.
So you're talking about how we should know to trust a poll. And I think one other kind of marker of trust is the name that's attached to that poll. We hear these different organizations like Ipsos, Siena, Pew, and I don't know really what any of these places are or what they do other than, I guess, release a lot of polls. But how should we be thinking about the names that are attached to these polls?
There's a lot of polling outlets out there, and a lot of them are good. I don't expect people to really remember who to trust and who not to, but I think there's a few things that people can look for when they're reading polls. If it's done by a big media organization, even one that's not the Post, you can be pretty confident in them trying to do a really good job, right?
Mm-hmm. New York Times poll, Wall Street Journal poll, and Associated Press poll, like these are all
and then TV
reputable
networks too, and you can also see how much information they've shared about that poll. So if there is a methodology statement that talks about margin of error and sample size and things of that nature, that can give you some more confidence. Also, look at the question wording. A poll should release the wordings of their questions. You don't have to have a master's degree in polling methods to understand if a question is fairly written and if something is leading or trying to get someone to respond in a certain way. But also, it's really important to just look and compare. There are outlets that share a bunch of different polls in one space, and you can look and see. Sometimes the outlier sometimes an outlier is not an outlier, right? If a race changes a lot, maybe the race changed. But if there's been like 5 polls in one state and 4 of them show a 2-point difference or a 1-point difference or an even, and one shows a 10-point lead, that 10-point lead might just be an outlier, but it could also show that the race is changing. So it's good to keep watching to see poll averages. The Washington Post has a poll average in a bunch of swing states and also nationally, and you can compare just to that average to see what you think and to see what others are measuring.
After the break, Martine and Emily talk about the public's trust issues with polls and what pollsters have done to improve since 2016. We'll be right back.
I want to acknowledge the elephant in the room here, because I think when you ask a lot of people about polling, whether polling can be trusted, they will often bring up instances or situations or elections where they felt like the polls weren't accurate. And one that comes to mind, obviously, for many people is 2016, where there is this widespread belief or feeling that people didn't see Trump's win coming, or that the polling didn't reflect that, and that's a reason to not trust the polls going forward. What would you say to someone who thought that?
In 2016 and 2020, polling was kind of far off. We're a self-critical group of folks, pollsters, and we meet every year at a conference and basically analyze what has happened in previous years and try to improve on what we've done before. And we really want to get it right. Political horse race polling is particularly hard because we need to figure out exactly who is turning out to vote in an election. And we don't know until after Election Day who voted. In 2016, a lot of polls showed Hillary Clinton ahead of Trump, but there were some that were a lot closer too, and it was a very close election. One way we've tried to improve since then is weighting by education. So we talk about ensuring that the population is reflective. That election in particular and subsequent elections, it's seen that people with higher educations tend to vote Democratic, and that wasn't necessarily the case with white people in previous elections. So making sure we have more balance and are able to do that. We also look at non-response issues more, trying to ensure that there's no group of people that's systematically not responding to surveys. So it's important to look at that, because this country chooses its president not based on popular vote nationally, but on the electoral map, which is very confusing and means that we have to do a lot more work to see what's happening. Mm-hmm. That, I think, was part of the reason that 2016 was surprising to so many people. Hillary Clinton was ahead in the popular vote in so many polls leading up to the election, but we don't choose our president in the U.S. based on popular vote. But there was a lot more polling being done at the national level. It was a really close election, and we've tried to improve on those results. In 2018, polls were better. In 2020, they were worse. And our goal is to improve and to get that right.
And it seems to me, at least, that by and large, like in recent elections, polls really have gotten it right. That 2018, 2022, the midterms, that there was a real matchup between polling and what actually transpired in the election.
We like to get it right.
What are some of the common mistakes that you see in people interpreting polls incorrectly?
I think it's good to have a skeptical hat on when you're seeing something from an advocacy group or someone who has skin in the game. They can ask questions in certain ways to get the answers that they want. News pollsters don't want to do that. Also, candidates and political partisans often will release a poll if it looks good for their candidate, but not if it looks bad for their candidate, and they'll be choosy about that. So you might say, oh, this congressional candidate is up 10 points according to them, but they might have had like 15 polls before then where it was neck and neck, and they just kept that to themselves because they're not a public pollster and they don't really have to release that. So
what you're saying is trying to be aware of
the source.
The folks who are putting out this poll, whether they have skin in the game, whether they're trying to advocate for something or they're on one side or the other, and that they have an incentive to create a skewed picture.
Absolutely. And I get a lot of that in my inbox. Those people are sending journalists a lot of stuff all the time.
I can imagine. One more thing that has come up relatively recently that I've been wondering about is this term prediction models, which to me sounds like a different way of saying poll, right? That like this is a thing that's going to tell you who's going to win and who's going to lose. What is a prediction model? And how should we be thinking about those?
Prediction models take polls and put them in a computer. This sounds like, explaining something to my dad, but just put into a compuder. The machine will take care of it.
The bips and bops and do the maths.
No, my dad is very good at understanding these things. He does a good job of explaining stuff to the other people in their 55-plus community about polling. It's like he's doing God's work. But prediction models and polls are different. Prediction models use polls along with other indicators that they figure out and put in to look at what might happen in the future. Polls are snapshots of what is happening right now. We're focused on today with a poll. Prediction models, you have to believe in the indicators that they're expecting to have an impact on the future. So at the Post, we don't have a prediction model, but we average polls, which is a bit different. So we're not looking into the future. We're trying to use what we have to give us the best picture of what is happening today. So we include both state and national polls, and we weigh them using information about who is putting that poll out to give us the best estimation of the true state of that race right as it is right now.
So you've talked about how polls work, why polls can be trusted when they come from reputable sources and when they have, large enough sample sizes, and like how polls can be really insightful. But I'm curious more from like a self-care standpoint. How much do you think people should be spending their day-to-day like following the ups and downs of this poll and that poll, and whether or not like a half-point percentage change in one direction or the other? Like, how much do you think that is informing the wider public in a useful way versus like maybe it's too much? Maybe you shouldn't be living and dying by whether or not your preferred candidate happens to have gotten a slightly more positive poll in the last 24 hours.
So I've been working in polling since 2008. That was my first presidential election, working in polling. And let me tell you that self-care is really important. And living and dying by your candidate's polls can be exhausting and probably not healthy, but please keep reading our stuff. I think it's good to be aware of it, but be aware of it in context. And still, polling is the best way to measure what a population thinks. And I think it's important to have compassion for voters. We have undecided voters. That's a fact. That can
I think some people find that very frustrating.
I think people find that really hard to believe.
Like how, at this point, how can you not be sure whether or not you want to vote for Donald Trump? Either you do or you don't. And what more information do you need?
People are complicated, and some of them are low information, but a lot of them aren't. And they have, if you voted Republican for your entire life, it might be hard for you to consider voting for a Democrat now, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. The people who respond to our surveys and the Americans overall, I'm so thankful to them, because a lot of us are in our bubbles, and a lot of us only talk to people who we see eye to eye on or have similar life experiences to us. And a poll can open up our eyes to how other people think and other people feel and how they live their lives. And there's a lot of people out there who aren't like us, and they deserve to have their voices heard just as much, and maybe even more so if they're more interesting and they're a bit unsure about who they're going to vote for and why they're unsure about who they're going to vote for. I think it's a great responsibility for us to measure people's opinions, because no one else is really doing that than pollsters. And we see a lot of news articles that quote experts, but I think the American people really are the experts, and they're the people that we do need to hear from and understand how they feel and think and why they're doing what they're doing.
Emily, I never thought that you would be able to make me feel emotional about polling. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you so much.
Emily Gusin is the deputy polling director for The Post. She spoke to my co-host, Martine Powers. Before I leave you, I wanted to share some news that I've been following today. We're still learning about how devastating Hurricane Helene has been. The death toll is now over 150, and that number is expected to rise. My colleague Brianna Sachs is on the ground right now in southern Georgia, in a town called Valdosta. This area was still recovering from a hurricane last year when Helene hit. Brianna was inside of a fast food restaurant when she met Jesse Johnson-Charu. Like her neighbors, Johnson-Charu has been dealing with trying to feed her family, and she hasn't had power for a week.
Yeah, and my baby, now that the lights are off, she got real bad asthma, and you could tell that the allergies are messing with her because she waking up with stuff matted in her eyes. She on a breathing machine that I can't get to because ain't no power.
How old is she?
She's 9.
And in a mobile park in a nearby town, Brianna met Vicki Lawrence. She's 67, and Lawrence and her neighbors haven't had running water for a week. She told Brianna how these conditions remind her of how she grew up with no running water.
Is it miserable? Yes, I hadn't lived like this since I was a kid. I grew up in Illinois, in the country, in a coal mine little town. 1 bar, 1 school, 1 church, and 1 little country store. We didn't have any more water. My God, that's so far in my past, I never thought I got to do that again. But here I am again.
Still, Lawrence said she's thankful to be alive. And this is something many residents have told Brianna, that this situation is really hard. But at least we're alive, and thank God for that. And we just learned new details about Trump's plot to overturn the 2020 election. They're in a new court filing in Trump's delayed federal criminal case. The filing comes from special counsel Jack Smith, and it was unsealed Wednesday. It details how many people in Trump's campaign and administration told him there was no proof the election was stolen, and how Trump tried to overturn the results anyway. Trump's attorneys asked the court to file their response by November 21st. When I first heard about this filing, to be honest, my first thought was, will this actually matter? Because didn't the Supreme Court make a ruling this summer that presidents have broad immunity from prosecution? Well, that kind of immunity is reserved for official presidential acts. This filing is intended to show Trump can still face trial by arguing he was acting as a political candidate, not as the president. And there could be a political fallout from this filing. My colleague, politics reporter Aaron Blake, will unpack that and more tomorrow in his podcast, The Campaign Moment. Usually, you can find The Campaign Moment on Fridays in our Post Reports feed, but we'll have a different episode here tomorrow. So head to the Campaign Moment podcast feed and subscribe so you'll be sure to catch it. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's show was produced by Ariel Plotnick with help from Bishop Sand. It was mixed by Sam Baer and edited by Rena Flores. Thanks also to Scott Clement and Brianna Sachs. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.